As those of you who are joining, we had a lot of signups for today, so there may be people continuing to join throughout. We were all talking about it's really encouraging to see 300 plus folks sign up to talk about team alignment and stakeholder alignment and talk about how we might work together. As I mentioned, my name is Christine Perfetti, and I'm based out of Arlington, Virginia, the DC area. I run my own product and UX consulting firm out of Virginia. And the purpose of today, we're coming together. This is a Maven lightning talk, but it's also part of our Product Connections talk series, where the goal of these conversations is to start talking more with each other from a product, UX, and engineering perspective. We know this does happen quite a bit, but we still see a lot of conferences and events and conversations where a bunch of product leaders will talk and wax poetic together, or a bunch of UX and engineering leaders. And we really need to get out of those silos and have conversations across our functions. So that is the goal of Product Connections. We're planning on having these talks about every 2 or 3 weeks, with representation from all of our groups, UX, product, and engineering. For today, as you all know, we're going to be talking about stakeholders and how to gain alignment with them, as well as how to gain influence. And I'm not going to spend minutes and minutes introducing our panelists, but I will say I am so delighted to have them there. When I knew we were having this conversation, the 3 panelists for today were the go-tos immediately. So I was thrilled to have you all here. Thank you. I was thinking to myself, how do I introduce you? Because I could spend about an hour plus talking about each of you, and I'm going to spend about 20 seconds. But to start, as I mentioned, I was looking for the product and UX leaders who I turn to for input and advice, especially on this topic. I'll start with you, Melissa. Thank you for joining. Melissa Pell is a product leader. She has close to 2 decades of experience in the product management world. She is an ex-Wayfair product leader, and she now, over the past couple of years, has been working as an executive product coach. She's also co-author of the recently published book and the excellent book, which I'm a huge fan of, behind you, Align, Stakeholder Management for Product Leaders. Thanks for joining, Melissa.
Thank you.
And Jen McGinn. Jen is a UX leader, UX pioneer, and luminary. She's a UX design executive with 2 decades of experience, and she is my go-to for many topics, especially talking about how do you gain influence as a design UX leader when it's sometimes the organization may not understand what we do. Jen has been an exec for years and years. She's currently the vice president of user experience at Flexera. She's worked at Oracle, Veracode. Thank you for joining us, Jen. I'm thrilled.
Thank you so much, Christine.
Of course. And Diana and I have known each other forever. Maybe not forever, but Diana is she's a design pioneer. She's author of the amazing book, Agile User Experience Design, which I'm a great fan of. And we talk quite a bit about the world of design, especially in this messy tech market. That may come up a little bit today, but Diana, again, thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. And so little housekeeping, and then we'll get going. If you have any questions for the panelists today, please put them in the chat window. I will be acting as a moderator and trying not to chime in as much as I usually like to about this topic. It may be challenging, but I will be monitoring the chat window. So if you have any questions for Diana, Jen, and Melissa, just chat away and I'll try to cover as many as we can. Another small little logistic. I mentioned that we're doing these talks every 2 to 3 weeks. We have an upcoming talk in 2 weeks that we'll also love to have you at if you're an IC, individual contributor. In a couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about how to make the leap from individual contributor to leader or manager. And you notice I highlighted leader or manager. Not all managers are leaders. Not all leaders are managers. So we're going to get into that discussion. shameless marketing pitch over, but if you're interested in, after you've heard this talk, going to our upcoming talk, please join us. I put the link in the chat. So with all of that, here's what we're going to do. For this first question, I've been thinking a lot about what I wanted to ask all of you. I'd like to start with asking you all the same question because I'm really curious how you might answer it, given your backgrounds. I mentioned we wanted to talk with folks from different competencies. Melissa today is a product leader and Jen and Diana as UX design leaders. I'm curious how much overlap there will be. But to start, if you're game, Jen, I'd love to start with you. And then I'll ask the other ladies on the line. Talking about influence and aligning with stakeholders in an organization. That's the topic for today. I'm curious if you were to pick just one recommendation to give everyone today who's thinking about this. How do I align my stakeholders? How do I get the power or influence I want? What is the one recommendation based on your lessons learned that you'd give?
Looking back, this seems really intuitive, but I think building the real relationship with the person, bringing a little bit of your humanity to the relationship, whether it's being a parent or having an aging parent or one of those things. I think really building that real relationship is the cornerstone of having influence and partnering with those peers across the aisle.
Thank you, Jen. I have some questions, but I'm going to leave it until we go through this round with all of you. Melissa, what would your answer be to that question in terms of forming connections, alliances?
My recommendation is to do everything with curiosity. Think about what the other person's perspective is, what their incentives are, what their motivations are, who they are as a person, like Jen said, but just being curious about them from How to Win Friends and Influence People. If you ask other people questions, they tend to like you more, which is not a cheat, but a trick, I think. And it helps you understand where they're coming from. And that will be helpful later if you need something from them, that you've already gotten to know them and that you understand their perspective and you can speak from their point of view and not necessarily from your point of view when you communicate.
Thank you, Melissa. And Diana, thoughts?
Yeah. So Jen gave my answer, as it turns out. Yeah, I know why you think I would disagree with that, but I don't. But I would say relationships for sure, because that's the first step to getting that alignment and finding out how to find the common ground in a work dynamic. But I will say that in this day and age of increasingly distributed teams, companies are insisting people go back to the office, but you're still working with distributed offices throughout the globe and in different time zones. So getting that connection when you may not see each other in person ever, or more than a couple times a year, requires an intentionality and effort. And I was actually talking about this with someone recently. It can even mean who is considering being a new manager, and she's in a very remote environment. So it can mean not necessarily putting recurring time on someone's calendar, because that's a big ask, but making sure that if you are not sitting physically in the same space, that you are setting aside time to talk to them outside of the transactional nature of the work you're executing on. And it doesn't have to, I have had some coworkers that if you just roll in and start doing personal chat, or I don't have time for this. So you can talk about work, but you don't have to talk about the work. You can say, how's my team doing? Do you have concerns? What's coming down the pike? What's keeping you up at night? So you can still establish that relationship within the frame of the work you're doing. But that stuff's so important. And even more so now that you don't have a lot of those opportunities in person as much as you used to.
I hear you all in talking about the importance of the relationship and connection. I have a question, and Diana, you spoke to this. I'm going to first turn it over to you, Jen, to answer this, because I hear from many product and UX leaders this notion of sharing a bit of yourself and showing your whole self and being authentic. And you talked about the personal aspect. Oftentimes from product and UX leaders, I'll see some and they'll say, that's really hard. And there's a little bit of uncomfortable feelings about bringing too much of who you are to the tech world specifically. I'm curious what your response to that is. And then I'd love after you respond, Melissa, you talked about you ask them about them too. I'm curious how these conversations start, starting with you, Jen. Like, how do you bring your personal self to work?
I think it has to be organic. Some of it you can, if somebody says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm late. I was taking my kid to an event," or "I have to leave early because I have to do X, Y, and Z." I think that's an opportunity to build that bridge, just learning about them. I think I agree with Diana. You don't want to just start every meeting with the personal, but you have to her point, which great answer, Diana. I think you need to make sure that you're not just in meetings when things are on fire and you're there to problem solve.
Mm.
And so that's the element of the relationship building that I think we're all alluding to, is making sure that when you are having that connection in those meetings, that it's not just crisis mode every time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so funny for UX leaders, product leaders who are really savvy in many cases personally, this whole discussion about having these conversations still seems sometimes tricky and messy. And back to
So this is where I do want to jump in, Christine, because the one place where Jen and I diverge on this is something you said, because there's a difference between connecting personally and bringing your whole self to work. And I think that's something that Jen has heard me react to in the past, because I do think that's actually the lie that gets told, especially to people coming into tech, that your employers want you to bring your whole self. I don't think that's actually true. So I think there is a fine line. And I think that's why people do struggle. There's a difference because some of us are moms, and we know sometimes you don't want to say, "I was picking up my kid," because you picking up your kid can be perceived as, you've got things pulling your attention away. Some other person picking up their kid might be a hero.
Yeah.
So there is a sensitivity, especially as mothers, to bringing in that element into the workplace. I think once you get up into leadership, you have the responsibility to do that anyway, to normalize it and make it more accepted. But I also think there's a limit of how much of your personal self you should bring to the workplace. Not in a bad way, like you should always be authentic, but maybe you don't need to overshare or open up too much.
That's an important component. Thank you, Diana, because when you're having these conversations, it's very important to understand what you do want to share and what you want to hear back. And for you, Melissa, when you were saying it's all about, when you're working with stakeholders, your curiosity and asking them, again, to Jen and Diana's point, there's a balance you make there. So when you're asking questions to your stakeholder, what are you asking them about?
There's the work stuff, right? And then there's like the personal stuff. I worked with somebody, he was in a room with a white background, no windows, no pictures, no nothing. He didn't even drink water on screen, like nothing. It was just, and so I was like, there's a concept called the affinity bias, right? Which is you tend to like people who you have something in common with. And you can definitely use this in a bad way to form teams of all the same kind of people, but you can use it in a good way to say, listen, I want to get to know you. Let's find something that we may have in common and get that relationship started. It was really hard to figure out what was going on with this guy because there's like no clues, no visual clues, no nothing. So I ended up going out to the city where he was in and made an excuse like, hey, let's get dinner, blah, blah, blah. And it turns out that he mostly eats vegan and he goes on like fasting retreats. And there's just like this interesting thing about them. And then when I worked with him after that, it was like, there was like a tension drop a little bit because I knew some things about him, he knew some things about me, and it was like, it was a little more comfortable. And it doesn't have to be like everything, right? But just something to make you like a real person, like an actual human. People tend to relax a little, and it's easier then to have the work conversations because you're like real people instead of just like this person with this blank background.
So I wanted to ask all of you, and it's aligned with what you said, Melissa. And I'll start. So we're going to talk a lot about even more recommendations you have, success stories you've had along your path. there's also a lot to be learned from failures along the way and mistakes we've made along the way. And I wanted to ask each of you, back to it is about connections and relationships. Is there a moment that stands out in your career where things just did not go well in terms of managing your internal relationships? And do you have one of those stories? And could you tell us what you learned? Diana, I see you laughing a little bit. Do you have a story you could share with us, and also lessons learned for all of us?
Yeah, I mean, I think this happens often. I think particularly in design, especially at the leadership level, you're often brought in, but they're not super sure why they're bringing you in, or they have a specific vision, which they may or may not share with you, that isn't necessarily the right alignment for what the business needs. There's definitely, I'm always, and this is, Jen will know this is my hot button issue, but I'm always blown away by the number of people outside of design who think player coach is a really great role for, say, a director level designer. And that's increasing in the industry, and it's a trend. It is what it is. But the people making those decisions aren't designers, or the people that demand portfolios for them to review, what are they even reviewing? Because they don't come from a design background. They're not asking questions of the end user. It's not to say that portfolios don't have value and they should be reviewed, but I'm always amazed that people outside of design are looking into design and not always communicating their needs. They have expectations. And so I have tripped over unexpressed expectations, most specifically with a situation where I had founders who had a toxic positivity energy. They didn't like to hear anything negative, which didn't work out, 2 rounds of layoffs later. They didn't want to hear anything that contradicted their opinion. And they also didn't want to give guidance. They really wanted to let you do your thing, and then they'd interrupt it or pull the rug out if they felt like it wasn't going in the direction they want. So that they didn't have a product plan. There was a lot of lack of direction across the board. It wasn't unique to design, but it was difficult. I would even do the probing questions like, what are our goals? What are your expectations? And the difficulty with which I could not get answers out of them made those relationships, it made it hard for me to execute and deliver on what they wanted, in part because they didn't have a product strategy for me to execute on, but also because there were all these unexpressed expectations. And I will say I did a lot of the work. It just, you can't get communication from people who don't want to verbalize or don't want to give over control. Because I think in the end, that was what it was for a lot of the leadership they brought in. They didn't want to relinquish their controls.
So what would you do differently?
What I might have done differently is not have worked there. But I think
that's important too, to know that.
Or left sooner, because I did hold out for a very long time a lot of hopes for that situation that were just not viable. Okay. Because I thought, I'll try this or I'll try this. And it really, there was no chance of success. Okay. But I think being more conscious that, and I think earlier I could have been more direct about it when I started to get some of the hints that I wasn't going to get guidance, which at the level I'm at is fine. I can execute without guidance, but I also wasn't getting feedback, right? Even when asked about it, or I would ask questions that would go unanswered, no matter how many times I asked them. So I think I might have taken those as the red flags that they were sooner than I did, and tried more aggressively to repair the relationship to see if it could be repaired or if I should be jumping ship.
Yeah. Thank you, Diana. Jen, no mistakes along the way, right?
I'm going to give you 3, but I'm going to go really fast.
3? You're cheating.
I could go on, but I've limited it to 3.
Okay, as long as you're fast.
Okay. So number 1, not really understanding the value of the first team. Design is always one of one in a leadership capacity. You might have multiple engineering peers, you might have multiple PM peers, but the person you report into, that's your first team. And really developing and curating those relationships with the people who also report to your manager. That's number 1. That's absolutely table stakes. And it took me a really long time to figure that out, even though people were giving me information. The second one is the switcheroo, where you have socialized your idea, but now your stakeholder is somebody new. Either somebody from the existing organization has moved into that role, or somebody new got hired, and you don't do a full stop to make sure that they're bought in. So that's the second one where I failed before. The third one I'll call the sniper. This is where you have socialized your idea to everyone you can imagine, and out of the blue, somebody comes from the side, shoots it down out of the air, and you didn't see it coming. And so you have to recover, make sure that they're involved going forward, and either work with them or find a way, and this is not a good situation, to work around them. So those are my three areas where I have failed.
We will talk more about the sniper, I'm sure. I call it the stakeholder torpedo. I think we all have names for that situation. Thank you.
And those
Thank
people.
you, Jen. And those people, yes. Melissa.
Yeah. I've been in all of these situations. I think one thing that I made a mistake of early on in my career was trying to let my boss do the politics for me instead of forming direct relationships with people myself. In some companies, it's very hierarchical and you can't necessarily create those one-on-one relationships, or it's awkward or it's frowned upon. But to the extent that you can figure out who your stakeholders are and try to build those direct relationships versus like just sitting around and waiting for your boss to do it, I think is great, because then you have those relationships and you can reach out directly and you don't have that sort of roadblock in the middle. And for the record, I call the sniper the swoop and poop. So.
Diana, do you have a different name? We don't have three names.
Is that different?
Well, sometimes it's the hippo. It's the hippo. Sometimes if it's the, you know.
But Jen's talking about somebody who you didn't even know was involved.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Like, not the person that you should have.
Sometimes that's the C-suite who wasn't involved, and then. But no, I've had a sniper. I have.
So we had an excellent question, and I appreciate it. I'm going to save it for later in the conversation because it was a question following up on Diana's comments about we're all women and we're all leaders, and there's different facets to that. Then we'll talk about it. And I so appreciate the question in the chat. We're going to hold off on that because that could be a 3-hour conversation.
That's its own session.
It is. And I did want to get into it, but thank you for the comment. Okay, so this may align with what you've already shared about developing relationships and connections, but I wanted to ask this, and anyone chime in who wants to take this one first. I'm thinking about when you arrive in an organization at the director level or above as a product and UX leader, those first 90 days can make or break oftentimes, you know, how you're perceived, the relationships you have. And my question is, how do you recommend leaders spend that first 90 days? And how do you spend that time? But thinking about your first arriving, what do you do to generate and have those relationships generate, cultivate the influence you'd like? Who would like to start? Jen?
Yep. So I think it starts before the first 90 days. I think it starts during the interview process. You're already learning about the organization with the people that you're talking with. I think we probably all have a very similar approach with the listening tour in the first 30 days. You're meeting as many people as you can. You're asking them what's working, what's not working, how has it worked well for you in the past, those sorts of things. Being curious, to Melissa's point, I would limit that to 30 days. And during that 30 days, I'm also going to be figuring out what are the biggest problems to solve. And at the end of the 30 days, I typically have a plan for a plan. So I'll give a report out at the end of 30 days and highlight to the executives and my team and my stakeholders what I've heard and get their feedback. During that first 30 days too, I would say there are going to be some offsites with my own team where we've got some dedicated time to gel, to work on vision and mission. But I compress it to the first 30 as being the most important. And then honestly, by 60 and 90, you're starting to take action and roll those things out.
I appreciate that, Jen. And I assume as well, the listening tour in the first 30 days, you're still spending, even though that listening tour is officially over, you're cultivating in an ongoing way the
Absolutely.
relationships and the conversations with everyone you were talking with in those first 30 days, right?
Yeah.
Or no, not.
Sometimes it's a one-off just to
Yeah.
understand who and who to reach out to. Sometimes you decide we're going to set up weekly one-on-ones, bi-weekly one-on-ones. What's our cadence of communication? What kinds of projects should I be involved in? What aliases, what teams groups, all of that. So it's really a discovery process. And I would say probably 60 to 90 people during that first 30 days is normal.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder, Jen, you mentioned that probably all of us would have the same answer to having a listening tour at the beginning. I'd be curious your takes on this because you all provide coaching to people moving into management and leadership. One of the biggest mistakes I hear from leaders, I don't know if it's a mistake. They'll say to me, I feel this pressure to have a win very early on in my tenure. I'm curious, any takes on that, where some of the mistakes they'll say in a pitfall is they took action very soon when they arrived. And I'm curious what your perspective is on that. I see a lot of nodding. I'll start with you, Melissa, and then I'll give you all a chance to respond. But what is your take on that, feeling the need to take action early?
Yeah, I read this article online that my brother-in-law actually sent me, where the author recommends that you create a WTF list, where you look at all the things you're like, what is going on here? And you write it down rather than complaining about it or trying to get to the bottom of it. You write it all down. And then you say, okay, I'm going to learn more about each of these things and I'm going to figure out which one is the biggest problem or whatever. And along the way, you learn who might be the biggest resistance to change. And you think about, okay, like, how do I actually go about doing something different? You also have to assume good intent. And also, you never know who you're talking to and what involvement they may have had in that thing that you think is stupid. I've made this mistake before, being like, we all know this is broken. And they're like, no, like, it's the best we could do with the information we had at the time, which is like the assumption you should make, is that however things are, it's the best decision that was available at the time. And we acknowledge the work that went into it and we're going to move forward. So thinking about what you want to take action on, like, I like the idea of trying to contribute, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to be creating a big change. It doesn't necessarily have to be like launching a big thing. It could be bringing clarity to a problem space that people were struggling with. It could be getting alignment among some people on a decision to move forward. It doesn't have to be like delivering a thing.
Yeah, because I think you have to be really careful of that temptation. I think the pressure is real. And I think that first win really does set you up for success. So I think maybe looking to get one at the end of the 90 days isn't the worst thing. But I think you don't know the culture, you don't know the history, you don't know the context. And so what you think might even be a big win could completely torpedo you. So I think you really have to resist it because you don't know what the right answer is just yet. I think you can get wins like what Melissa's describing by, okay, I did my listening tour. So I'm going to start following up with my key stakeholders or partners or allies to say, hey, listen, I'm hearing this. It feels like this is going on. I'm thinking of some solutions. Would you mind just brainstorming or giving me your hot takes? Am I reading this right? Is this wrong? What am I missing? I think those things and those relationships and establishing the direction you want to take can be big wins, or influencing the internal culture of your design team and people visibly seeing that. But I think there are wins that are safe to do that you can get very early on. But I think when you come in and you see something that drives you bananas and trying to tackle that in your first 90 days will almost always be a bad idea because you just don't even know if it's the right answer. So you could be wasting an enormous amount of really critical political capital in the wrong place.
Yeah, and that's where I agree totally with both of you. I think that's where having some sort of readout at the end of 30 days to say, here are my observations. What do you think? Here are the next steps that I think need to be taken. What do you think? To get that alignment up front so that you're not taking action. I think as designers, we know that the thing that we need to do is to make sure that we're solving the right problem. But then as we get into these leadership roles, sometimes people have a tendency to forget that because they feel like they're really on the line, that they have to prove themselves. So I think it's just falling back on what we know and ensuring that we are solving the right problem.
I think that brings up a good point too, of using the skills that we have as designers and product managers and engineers of, okay, what is the problem I'm trying to solve? What are the constraints I have on the system? What are the tools at my disposal? But using that not only to solve the actual like product problem, but to solve cultural problems or to figure out what's my goal or what's my goal with this person? How do I find out more about them so I can figure it out?
This is more of a tactical question for you, Melissa. I know this was in your book, and I was making the assumption that you all construct and run similar listening tours, but I don't know if that's true. So I just wanted to ask you from a tactics perspective, Melissa, coming in as a product management leader and running these listening tours, who do you want to talk to and what do you want to find out?
Yeah, so that's a good question. What my recommendation is, and I talk about this in the book, is the org chart is not necessarily the right place to start, right? It's a place to start, but we talk about in the book power players, and those come in a number of different flavors. And those are the people who like might be obvious, they might not be obvious, but like they can torpedo stuff. And it may be like the CEO's admin who controls the CEO's calendar, who you need to be friends with that person.
Oh, 1000%. Always be friends with your admins, always.
Right. But there's two types of power players that we talk about in the book. One is like the CEO whisperer, who's maybe somebody that person worked with before. Maybe they have a weird title like partnerships or evangelist or something, like whatever it is. So that person for sure. And then the department-based power players. So if your company is sales led, you want to learn about sales and figure out who's in that group and who can be your friend. If you're engineering led or operations led, whatever it is, right? That sort of dominant discipline usually has the majority of the power players in there.
Thank you, Melissa. Thoughts, Jen, Diana?
Yeah, I think I would agree with that as a rule of thumb, because I think who you talk to depends on where you are. Like if you don't have a really sales driven company, I worked at a startup where you only got to CEO by being the head of sales, right? Like several times over. So all the power in that organization was in the sales leadership, not the salespeople themselves, because they had such huge turnover. But in another organization, it was the product management structure that I happened to report into that had all the influence. Getting to know different people in there, but there was also the key expert in a special domain who was the world's expert in this, but you wouldn't have known it because he was an engineer of a right who's super chill, he didn't stand out, but you had to connect with him because he had the ear of everybody in the C-suite, because he was also a lovely man, so it was easy. But so you've got to look for those like hidden power players, make sure you're allies. I think the biggest danger, and Jen, I'm sure you've seen this too, Melissa, I don't know if you've seen it, but in design, only being friends with your designers. I've seen so many leaders fail to make allies across the business org, and there's just no winning. And in design, you cannot afford to do that. I don't think any discipline can, but especially not design. So make sure you're creating friends with your peers, either levels up or levels down, but make sure you're getting across that org.
Yeah, this is going to be, thank you, Diana. And this is going to be a question for you, Jen, because we've talked about it in the past, but it plays into Melissa and Diana, what you were just saying, like power and influence and where you fall in the organization matters. You'll hear some people saying, you can have influence and transform your organization no matter where you are. And is that true? And what I mean by that
is you have a millennia.
Well, you've all come into organizations when you've reported into maybe product or a different organization, maybe been at the manager level versus being at the C level. And there's different decisions and actions you'll take. And I wanted to start with you, Jen, given your career trajectory, going up the ladder now at the exec level, what are the implications? How do you influence when you're at very different levels in the organization? And what do you recommend?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Coming back to the first team, if you are a peer of everyone else, let's say that your engineering peers or directors, they're reporting to a VP, you're a director, or same thing, you're all VPs and you're reporting to the same EVP. That's a really great place to be, because even if you're outnumbered, you're all at the same level. I think the challenge that we face a lot of times as design leaders is that we are down leveled from our peers. And so at my last company, we were literally down leveled 3 to 4 levels from the people that we were interacting with. And that creates a really weird power dynamic where we don't always have the ability. We do have to influence up and across the organizations, but they don't take us as seriously. They can more easily dismiss us. And so you have to try different things to ensure that you're aligning with their goals to make sure that you're driving towards the same outcomes. I think if you're all reporting into the same manager, it's super easy because you have the same goals. And then if for any reason there's a misalignment, you have someone who can help resolve that issue at a higher level and say, well, the business really needs this versus that. So my preference is to always be at the same level as my peers, but that's just not how every organization works.
Melissa, from a product leadership, product management, have you always been in a product management led organization?
No.
What has your experience been like?
I've seen a lot of times, right? There's like a CEO and a COO and a CFO and a CRO and like a VP of product and a director of design. Yes. A lot of times they'll like welcome that group in as like a courtesy, but it's not really often seen at the same level. I think in certain situations, as if you find yourself in a management capacity, for you to bring in your team with your peers to help right that discrepancy, that's helpful. Ideally, you'd have kind of a set of disciplines that all be at the same level, but that's not always true. But I think back to where we started, which is like forming those human relationships with people, that can start to break down those like hierarchical barriers. Because yeah, like we both take the same bus to the office, or like we both just got a new puppy, or whatever it is. There's some sort of connection. You feel that affinity, and you can work around that hierarchy by trying to form relationships.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Melissa. Most common question I hear from product and UX folks in terms of working with stakeholders, they do well forming the connections oftentimes. What do you do when a stakeholder comes to you with a request and you have to say no? That's the way they frame it. What do you do in that situation?
I don't say no. I say, I would love to. Let's work on the prioritization to do that, right? Let's figure out how to staff it and how it stacks with the other priorities.
I'd
like to say yes, but what can I say no to?
I knew a bunch of us were going to agree most of the time. We've been around for a while.
You have to say the N word.
That's what I wonder. Do you always say yes?
Yeah, I like to think of that as the wrong question, right? Because it puts up kind of an us versus them scenario where they're coming to you and you have to decide whether or not you're like their thing or whatever. So what I think is a better way to approach it, right, and this is a big difference, is you have to make sure that you are agreeing on your goals first and foremost with your stakeholders, and on even how you're prioritizing things, so that you can agree on, we're going to make the prioritization based on these factors. And so if you are aligned on your goals and you're aligned on how you're going to make decisions, then if something new comes up, we're going to say, okay, does it align with this goal that we agreed on or not? should we change the goal? Maybe something has changed. Maybe we need to change the goal. But we can, if you let somebody into your decision-making prioritization process, then we can say yes or no together versus this kind of front of, sorry, I can't do that.
So I love that. And I'm super supportive, but I think there's a lot of organizational maturity that's required for that dynamic.
Absolutely.
Right? And that organizational maturity is absent in many organizations, especially startups, where things change fast and your product strategy changes every 3 months, like 180 degrees, or you're at a large company, all that's been agreed on 6 months out. There's a sales driven reason that they're coming to you and they're asking you for your resources. And sometimes, and I would say designers, especially because we don't always have influence and because we always feel stretched thin and in danger of losing our job, losing funding, we want to say yes to everything. And I think we do it at our detriment. Like, it does not serve us. And so I agree with both of you in that 90% of the time I will say, yes, but what would you like me to trade off? Or, okay, but these are the implications, and just walk through the decision-making process. But there are some times when you have a serial abuser, right? Like, who's coming to hit you up for little things, or there's a cultural shift that made sense at one point, but it doesn't make sense now, or they're doing something that's going to really impact your resources to a point that you can't sustain it, or they haven't given you the headcount you need. So yes, it's important. Yes, you'd love to do it, but you literally can't. Like, sometimes you do have to say no, because there has to be a boundary. At some point, you have to push back on the executives so that they know, I cannot continue with these resources, or I cannot continue with these asks coming up last minute or sideways through the process. Like, sometimes the no matters because you have to really make that boundary. So you're like, yes, like, I would love for all my conversations to be what the two of you just described, but my reality has been different, where I've literally had to say, you've got to stop doing that. You know what I mean? Like, you really have to have like the tough conversation and be like, hey, one of my best designers just quit because of what you did. So now we have to talk about it, right? Like, you have to, and to be candid, that difficult conversation went really well. I was very close with that person afterwards, but you have to sometimes use capital N, capital O, no.
Yeah, it's better to make people disappointed now than to say yes and have them be disappointed later after multiple promises and maybes and sort ofs. Because I mean, it feels hard to rip the Band-Aid off, but it's better than stringing them along when you know it's a no the whole time.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, I'm all about managing.
So I want to be clear on that one. That's not a thing that I do, but I do fundamentally disagree, because I will make the decision with my stakeholder. I think that's really important, so that we are aligned, so I'm not, it's not us versus them. This is us figuring out the priorities together. So it isn't a no, it's we can do this with the resources we have. Let's prioritize. And then when we get to the next thing, now we have to be planful. We need to bring in contractors. We need to hire. So the one place where I will firmly say no is back to Diana's earlier point. It is not the leader's job to do design. And you cannot be a fungible resource and still do your leadership role. And so that's an absolute no.
Yeah, I will say, Jen, a lot of my no is when someone's coming in the side. It's usually, honestly, in my experience, for me, it's often been like an engineering leader, a PM lead, who is happy to make the trade-off for someone else's product for them, right? So sometimes it's not a decision that is just between the two of you, right? Exactly. So it's not an issue of you deciding with them. It's, they're like, oh, sure, drop that other product, because of course they don't get. So sometimes it's not just the two of you, and so you're saying no for the organization. But again, I prefer not to say no, just to be clear. But
this is
I think
also
this brings up,
because you've only got so many no's.
Go ahead, Melissa.
That's a good point, because it brings up like who gets to make the decision, right? Who decides the yes or the no? And sometimes it's somebody who's not in the room. And so I've found a lot of times that making progress in something is blocked. And I'm like, why is it blocked? Why can't we make a decision? Oh, because we haven't actually included the person who has the authority to make this decision.
Yep. This is an unfair request for the three of you. I had promised we get back to the notion of women in leadership. One more question before we go there specifically.
We'll never come back.
Well, we've talked a lot about scenarios where it can be really challenging or mistakes we've made. You all have such a wealth of experience of driving change and transforming organizations, influencing, generating buy-in from stakeholders. If you were, and I know I do this, I feverishly take notes from leaders. If you were to pick 1 to 2 things that you haven't had a chance to share yet that are strategies you use to cultivate influence in an organization, what would you tell our attendees? Where should they focus? And this is the unfair part. You have a minute each for this. I was going to start with you, Jen. Are there a couple of recommendations you have for folks?
I've been working remotely for more than 20 years, primarily. I didn't believe in the in-person sort of effect. I think now, as I'm more mature, as I'm higher in the leadership ranks, I think it's absolutely 100% necessary to meet people in person. As humans, this is how we are designed to connect with one another. And as much as, like, when you're in agreement, it's great. Like, you, Christine, and I have never met in person, but when you have those challenging situations, having that in-person relationship to fall back on is really necessary.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Jen. Diana?
So that's a really good one. There's just a lot that I think one of the things I would say, a lot of times we will lean away from the difficult relationships. There's always someone that drives you crazy or someone you don't get along with. And so so the tendency is to avoid them or skip those meetings or not. Lean into those relationships, work harder, because those need the work, right? And it's not going to happen on their own. And if you only tend to the good relationships, you're not going to make the progress. So I'd say lean into those, because I've been surprised. There's been many times when I've ended up with a really great relationship with that person because I did do that. Yeah, I think that's probably the main one I'd stick with.
Thanks, Diana. And Melissa?
I would say that if there is some behavior that somebody is exhibiting that doesn't make sense to you, it clearly makes sense to them. And there's probably something that you don't understand yet, which is part of the being curious. Sometimes they're just out to get you. Like, that is possible. But usually there's something going on that you can't see, right? Their boss is hounding them over something. They have trouble at home. They're whatever it is, right? Maybe they've misunderstood something that you've done. And I think that thinking about, okay, this is just like a person that maybe I could see at the grocery store sometimes. There's just like a human being that has other stuff going on aside from me. And what is it that I don't understand yet about them that would make this troubling behavior appear?
Yeah.
Assume good intent. Right?
Or just incompetence. Don't assume malfeasance. No, that's one of the sayings too.
No, that's totally valid.
No, I hear you.
Because sometimes people just mess up or not, but don't assume bad intent is the point of that. Right? What you can blame on laziness or incompetence, don't. Like, people just drop balls. Like, people are busy. It's fine.
Yep. Okay. As promised. So we have all of you are tech leaders and all of you are women in the tech world. And Diana, you spoke to this, and an attendee asked, and I asked this a lot, as women in tech and women leaders, there was the whole discussion about when you're in a leadership position, trying to increase influence. Like, how do you think about that? And how do you balance that? The question specifically was, I want to know, what do you all think about women in leadership positions in tech, in remote work, not to be perceived as too willing to be part of a team, too cold, too warm? Like, what can women do? And is there different behavior that you've had to take compared to your male counterparts? Who wants to start?
Yeah, I'll tackle this. So
Okay.
I will say, to some extent, I don't think about it, because at the end of the day, if I'm working with a misogynist, he's not going to change his mind, and I'm not going to stop being a woman. So in many ways, it may be interesting to know that's the motivation for their behavior, but neither one of us is going to change. So we just move on. I just move on. I don't get too spun up about it. Having said that, the workplace has changed tremendously from when I started 25 years ago. I saw some things I can't unsee. I would definitely recommend everybody read the book Brotopia, because I think it does speak to the female experience in tech and what's influenced that. But, or rather, the male dominated experience and why it is the way it is. I think you have to be conscious of it, because I think there are biases, and there are, if you're a new mother, that can often be perceived a certain way, that you're slacking on your job, or you're not going to be committed to your job because you've got a child, or even if you announce that you're pregnant. It's real, right? So decide what you're comfortable disclosing if you're not in a position of authority and power, and go from there. But don't let it hold you back, right? You have to be a mother. You have to have these balances. And if your workplace isn't going to be a place that supports you in doing that, then you need to find another workplace, right? I don't, as far as being remote, as you can tell from the, I don't hold back. I'm pretty candid. I'm pretty open. This isn't any different. This actually is probably more grown up than I am in the workplace. Like, it's, so I have a pretty comfortable affect that works for me remotely. And as you guys mentioned, like, face-to-face time is important. So I will connect with people face-to-face on visits and things. And so I haven't struggled with that balance of being too cold. I will say sometimes I've been too impersonal, because coming up, it was focused on business. And I had a boss at one point who didn't have healthy boundaries between personal and business. And so I've always been leaned back. I've leaned more into making sure that I'm caring for my team as a whole person in later years. But so I think that comes through with my teammates and my colleagues. So yeah, this hasn't been too much of a struggle for me, but that's just, I'm a loud and bossy personality, I think, perhaps.
Melissa or Jen? Melissa?
Sure. I think you have to test the waters with people, right? Because especially if you don't know people yet, but also you just have to figure out how they respond to things, right? If you say, oh, I have to go pick up my kid, and they're like, I don't know about that, right? Then you figure out how much of that you want to share, and it shouldn't be like that, but that's reality sometimes. To have these sort of different, I don't know, archetypes in mind that you might be facing, and to try to think about, oh, is that because this person is a misogynist or is biased in some way or whatever, and figuring out what you want to say and what you don't. I usually lean towards transparency personally. Like, I'm not going to share my whole life story, but I'll share something here and there and see how they react to it. If they're like, that's nice, or if they're like, oh yeah, me too, then you get a feel of how you should be building that particular relationship based on kind of the feedback that you get.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Jen?
I'm going to take a hard left turn here. I have been getting some coaching in my last job, and it was in response to some feedback I had gotten. But I also teach a graduate level class in UX leadership and management. And in the second semester that I was teaching that, I started hearing things from my female students that were echoing the experience that I had. And I was like, it was a breakthrough moment for me, where I was like, wow, this is not just a me problem. This is a we problem. And so there's a really great book that describes the problem of either being able to be perceived as likable or competent. And the book, I think, is called The Likability Trap, and it doesn't have a great solution. It really describes the problem very well. There's another book that I've started recently, I haven't finished, but it might have the solution to this. Pardon the title, it's called Likeable Badass, but it really is focused on women and ensuring that you are getting the status that you need while being perceived as likable at the same time. And there are all these things, person by person. I don't disagree with anything that Melissa said or that Diana said, but I do want to answer the original question. And I think that there are things that we need to be aware of, and things that we can do, and things that we can't do, and make available the resources that we know about.
Thank you for the book. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to lean in, like, The more power you get, though, the more obligated you are to be more open, to talk about your children. Because when you're in a position where you review, or I worked one place where I wasn't able to give my employee her rating that she deserved for her performance for the year because she'd been on maternity leave, and my company made her clock it, prorate it. And I was like, which affected not only her raise that year, but her bonuses for years to come. And so, yes, I didn't stay. I wasn't in a position to influence. I did complain about that. I did push back on it. The more senior you are, the more you have to make statements. I've worked at places where sexual harassment was rampant and occurred in a C-suite executive. And because I was in a position of authority, I made sure that my boss, his boss, their boss, like everyone around me knew where I stood on that issue. So I think you have to use your power when it matters, the more power you have to use to normalize parental leave for both men and women, and to be supportive of the men who are taking parental leave and things like that. And I think there's modeling we can do the more you go up the ladder, and because you have that power, you're obligated to do that.
Diana, Melissa, Jen, thank you for this conversation. Learned a ton. I did want to ask, for those of you attendees who stayed on for the entire time, I have a specific question for you before you leave, and for us. I mentioned that we are going to be having these discussions with product, UX, and engineering. We were missing our engineering counterpart, but the plan is we will have our engineering leaders. If we're having these topics and conversations, having these leaders together with equal representation, what topics would you like us to discuss? If there's things on your mind, if there's things that you'd like to discuss with product, UX, engineering leaders, please put them in the chat window for us. We'll be having, this same group is coming back in 2 weeks, but we're planning on, depending on the topics, bringing in other product and UX leaders. So please, if there's anything pressing for you, please put it in the chat window. Also, I wanted to invite you all, Melissa, Jen, and Diana are coming back with me in 2 weeks for another Maven Lightning talk. This topic is near and dear to our hearts. So I put in the chat window the topic, but it's making the leap from individual contributor to manager and leader, or manager or leader for PMs and UXers. This is our next topic because the four of us hear this question all the time. So we know for engineering, product, UX, this is a pressing topic, and we do want to get into discussions and see where we think alike, where differently. But our plan is, as a group, as we're bringing more people in, to do this on a regular basis. So thank you for joining us. This was our kickoff of this format. So thank you all for joining. Couple other final housekeeping. I've recorded the session. Maven will kindly send out this recording to you after the fact. If you have any feedback when you get the recording, you can also contact me. We'd like to hear what you liked, didn't like, what could be improved. As we move forward regularly, we can have the right topics and put this together in a way that works for all of you. Melissa, again, thank you. Melissa, Diana, Jen, this was fantastic. It was so great to see you all, and thank you for all of the great recommendations.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Yeah, it's hard when it's so quiet. Oh, but these are questions coming in.
They are good questions.
Mhm.